Chapter 2, page 15. I was more or less warmed up by this time, so I pulled my scarf up around my face and went out after the two foremen. They had ascended a rickety wooden ladder and were walking along the blast furnace foundation, looking at the tons and tons of structural steel in process of erection on all sides. Over their heads was a 10-foot diameter gas pipe, one section of which was not yet in place. To their left was the enormous conical bosh of the fourth blast furnace. They walked past this and down through the cast house toward number 3. A few dim bulbs cast a gray dawn around the job. Several scurrying figures could be seen. Bricklayers, laborers, mechanics, electricians, getting things lined up for the day's work. I caught up with them, and the 3 of us climbed up to the top of number 3. We found a little group of riveters standing silently around a shapeless form lying on the wooden scaffold. We discovered that it was the frozen riveter, and having ascertained that a stretcher had already been sent to take the body down, we went to the very top to look over the coming day's work. "How's school going?" asked Ivanov. "You'll be a technician pretty soon, won't you, Kolya?" "It's pretty tough studying when it's as cold as this," said Kolya. "We have to take our gloves to the classroom with us. Not enough coal." "Yeah, I know," said Ivanov sympathetically. "It's tough studying, but then, what the hell? If you want to learn, you've got to work." By the time the 7 o'clock whistle blew, the shanty was jammed full of riggers, welders, cutters, and their helpers. It was a varied gang: Russians, Ukrainians, Tartars, Mongols, Jews, mostly young, and almost all peasants of yesterday. Though a few, like Ivanov, had a long industrial experience. There was Popov, for instance. He had been a welder for 10 years and had worked in half a dozen cities. On the other hand, Kabulian, the Tartar, had never seen a staircase, a locomotive, or an electric light until he had come to Magnitski a year before. His ancestors for centuries had raised stock on the flat plains of Kazakhstan. They had been dimly conscious of the Tsarist government, that they had to pay taxes. Reports of the Kyrgyz insurrection in 1916 had reached them. They had heard stories of the October Revolution. They even saw the Red Army come and drive out a few rich landlords. They had attended meetings of the Soviet, without understanding very clearly what it was all about, but through all of their lives had gone on more or less as before. Now Shaimet Kalabluyan was building a blast furnace bigger than any in Europe. He had learned to read and was attending an evening school, learning the trade of electrician. He had learned to speak Russian. He read newspapers. His life had changed more in a year than that of his antecedents since the time of Tamerlane. Ivanov, Kolya, and I entered the shanty just as the whistle started to blow. The cutter's Brigadier 1 was already in the center of the room assigning his men to their various places for the day. Welders were getting electrodes and buttoning up their coats. The burners were working over their hoses, swearing graphically as they found frozen spots or as disputes arose about torches, generators, or wrenches. By the time the whistle had finished blowing, most of the men had left the room, whistling cheerfully, kidding with each other, and swearing at the cold. A brigadier is a sort of straw boss in charge of a gang of 8 or 10 men, subordinate to the foreman, so below him. Page 17. The foreman gathered around the table. The telephone rang incessantly. A welder was wanted at the blowing station. 2 of the riggers in the gang working on the open hearth gas line had not come to work. The gang could not hoist the next section of pipe short-handed. Ivanov swore at the absentees, their mothers and their grandmothers. Then he went out to borrow 2 men from another gang. Kolya wrote out a list of the welders and what they were doing. He wrote it on newspaper. The ink was a semi-frozen slush. This list formed the basis on which the workers would get paid for the day's work. He thrust it into his pocket and went to the clean gas line to see how things were going. I took my mask and electrodes and started out for number 3. On the way, I met Shubkov, an ex-Kolk, a great husky youth with a red face and a jovial voice, the 2 fingers missing from his left hand. "Well, Jack, how goes it?" he said, slapping me on the back. My Russian was pretty bad, but I could carry on a simple conversation and understand almost everything that was said. "Badly," I said. "All our equipment freezes. The boys spend half their time warming their hands." Nikivov and whatever. "That doesn't matter," said the dish-franchised riggers brigadier. "If you lived where I do, in a tent, you wouldn't think it's so cold here." "I know you guys have it tough," said Popov. "You had joined us. That's what you get for being Kolaks." Sebkov smiled broadly. "Listen, I don't want to go into the political discussion, but a lot of people living down in the special section of town are no more Klakas than you." Popov laughed. "I wouldn't be surprised. Tell me, though, how did they decide who was to be de-Klukized?" "Ah," said Shabov, "that's a hell of a question to ask a guy that's trying to expiate his crimes in honest labor. Just between the three of us, though, the poor peasants of the village get together in a meeting and decide. So-and-so has 6 horses. We couldn't very well get along without those in the collective farm. Besides, he hired a man last year to help on the harvest. They notify the GPU, and there you are. So-and-so gets 5 years. They confiscate his property and give it to the new collective farm. Sometimes they ship the whole family out. When they come to ship us out, my brother got a rifle and fired several shots at the GPU officers. They fired back. My brother was killed. All of which naturally didn't make it any better for us. We all got 5 years and in different places. I heard my father died in December, but I'm not sure." Shabkov got his canvas, tobacco pouch, and a roll of newspaper and thrust both toward Popov. Kulak smoke?" He smiled grimly. Popov availed himself of the opportunity and rolled a cigarette. "Da. A lot of things happen when we don't hear much about. But then, after all, look at what we're doing. In a few years now, we'll be ahead of everybody industrially. We'll all have automobiles, and there won't be any differentiation between Kalaks and anyone else." Popov swept his arms dramatically in the direction of the towering blast furnace. Then he turned to Shabkov. "Are you literate?" ? "Yes," said Shabkov. "I studied 3 years. I even learned a little algebra. But now, what the hell? Even if I were really well educated, they wouldn't let me do any other work but this. What's the use of me studying? Anyhow, they won't even let me put in any but an elementary school. When I get home from work, I want to raise my elbow and have a good time." Shabkov touched his throat with his index finger, to any Russian a symbol of getting drunk. "This I know." We arrive at number 3. Shabkov swung onto a ladder and disappeared up into the steel. Popov looked after him with a wrinkled forehead. Shabkov was one of the best brigadiers in the whole outfit. He spared neither himself nor those under him, and he used his head. And yet he was a Kulak, serving a sentence, living in a section of town under the surveillance of the GPU, a classy enemy. Funny business, that. Popov didn't thoroughly understand it. Popov and I set about welding up a section of the bleeder pipe on the blast furnace. He gave me a break and took the outside for the first hour. Then we changed around from the high scaffolding nearly 100 feet above the ground. I could see Kolya making the rounds of his 30-odd welders, helping them when they were in trouble, swearing at them when they spent too much time warming their hands. People swore at Kolya a good deal too, because the scaffolds were unsafe or the wages bad.